Hello, everybody. This is Miss PG again from WCA Biology B. Here we are doing Lesson 8, Biodiversity at Population Levels. And just as a reminder, which I try to remind you every video, but I know I forget sometimes, there's a link below my picture. It is on my website, and it's going to link you to the study guide for this video. Our keywords today are biodiversity, community, and population. And so again, we're kind of touching on some of the topics we've already talked about in this unit. We first introduced the term ecology here. So they're investigating how organisms interact with their environment. That's what ecologists do. And I also put in here, it's kind of important, is they're investigating how populations change due to limited resources. So how does changing environments affect population of organisms? This is something that scientists are very interested in. They're also interested in how different populations kind of affect each other. So looking at whole communities, because sometimes we have changes in one population that has an impact on another population. It gives us kind of a broader perspective of what's going on. And then we talk about something called biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of organisms that are found in an ecosystem. And a healthy ecosystem is biodiverse. As I mentioned earlier, some ecosystems are more diverse than others just naturally. But what we want to have is to maintain the natural level of biodiversity within that specific ecosystem. Some ecosystems that are extremely biodiverse include tropical rainforests and coral reefs. So we have our terrestrial, kind of most diverse of all ecosystems, and the coral reefs being the aquatic, most diverse of all ecosystems. What do you find here? You find a wide variety of different plant life. You find a ton of different types of animals. There are mammals like jaguars and rats. There's birds like toucans and hornbills. There are thousands, millions of different types of insects. The canopy of the rainforest has over 1 million insect species all by itself, many of which have not even yet been cataloged. The species richness gives the tropical rainforests lots and lots of biodiversity. So I have on here what can cause changes in biodiversity, and are those changes temporary or permanent? So ecosystems are constantly changing and biodiversity changes with them. Some of them are just temporary, seasonal changes, for example, in biodiversity, or changes that have to do with natural cycles of drought, for example, can be temporary changes in biodiversity. If a food source decreases, the species that eats it may suffer losses, while others are more long-term. Deforestation, for example, clear cutting of forests can permanently decimate biodiversity in a specific area. All the organisms that lived here either have to move someplace else or they die. Other types of changes that can cause biodiversity loss are severe weather. We saw that recently with the tornadoes in Kentucky. Introduction of a new species. I've talked a little bit about invasive species in my previous lessons here. Introduction of a new species can cause loss of biodiversity. It doesn't always happen. In fact, most introduced species are not invasive, but when they are invasive, they can really wreak havoc on biodiversity. In this area right now, we are losing all of our ash trees. We have an introduced species, an invasive species, the emerald ash borer, that is just decimating our ash trees all throughout the United States. And this is just one example, excuse me, of how introducing a non-native species can wreak havoc on an entire ecosystem. You lose the ash trees, ladies and gentlemen, and all the animals that roost in those trees and live in those trees, the squirrels, the birds that live there, the birds that feed upon the insects that live in them, they're all going to suffer the consequences of the loss of the ash trees. You also can have increased predation that can cause changes in biodiversity. These are just some examples. We'll talk about a few more examples coming up in the next part of the lesson. So it says here that the largest impact on biodiversity is habitat loss. And the largest contributor to habitat loss is people. People cause most of the habitat loss in all ecosystems. And this is due to humans' desire to use that land for other purposes. They clear cut areas of forest to use for agriculture, or they take an area that once was an ecosystem, a prairie, for example, and they construct a new housing subdivision there, right? So organisms then that lived there have no place to live. They can't survive. They may have food and other resources, but they don't have a place to stay. And if they don't have a place to call home, that organism is vulnerable and can suffer losses. As it goes on to talk about human population and how it is estimated that by the year 2050, we will have close to 10 billion people on the planet, which I know in a previous lesson they talked about as being the potential carrying capacity of humans on Earth. I think we'll kind of see if that actually holds true. But all of these people need a place to live, just like all the organisms in the tropical rainforest or any other organisms. So humans have to cut down trees to make room for new housing developments, shopping malls, parking lots, etc., 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 right? And so we just continually take from other habitats to be able to live ourselves. It also talks about how coral reefs, which again, like the rainforests of the ocean, right, they're highly biodiverse, and that there's a lot of problems with the coral reefs that's also impacting the biodiversity. In this case, it is discussing climate change and how climate change impacts coral reefs. We talked a little bit about this, I don't remember which lesson it was, just more recently here, how corals have an algae that lives within the coral. They actually live in this mutualistic relationship with algae, the zooxanthellae, and the algae are kind of temperamental. They need a very specific temperature to be able to survive and thrive. And if the temperature of the water gets too warm, the algae will leave the coral. They'll migrate away, find another place to go. And the corals, without the aid of the algae, they die eventually. The algae are they're autotrophs, so they can provide food for the coral. And so coral reefs are dying. And they're dying because of climate change, which we know has been impacted by human activities as well. So, as people, we're kind of not being real nice to the environment here. We're having a lot of devastating effects. And I think we're all kind of more aware of this now. And hopefully in the future, today and in the future, we can make some steps to mitigate the damage that we are causing to the environment. So moving on to the last part of this lesson, it talks a bit more about biodiversity. And I just wanted to include this because it talks a little bit about a few more things that affect biodiversity. A lack of food, lack of space, lack of mates, increased or decreased in temperature, changes in air or water quality. All of those things kind of help, they kind of like hurt, I guess, biodiversity. It's not even including like competition for like invasive species and stuff in this list. So both lists are somewhat incomplete, but all of those things are affecting biodiversity. So how can we help? What can we do to increase biodiversity? And so they talk a little bit about one of the things that we can do. We can set up wildlife preserves that are protected from any form of human intervention. Here, communities of organisms that live there, they're not subject to hunting, chemical dumping, or impacts of logging. And it talks a bit about some of these wildlife reserves that have been set up throughout the country. Specifically, it's talking here about the efforts of President Theodore Roosevelt, who extended these conservation efforts to many other species. He set up a lot of different wildlife refuges. He set up a lot of different national parks and stuff like that to help preserve wildlife and to kind of mitigate the effects that we were having on the natural world. So that is pretty much the gist of this lesson, ladies and gentlemen. Again, if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.